How can we take the schools? How can we get this district that's now on its knees, scrambling to stay alive, and kill it?
Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Teachers, unions, charter schools, Common Core standards, and high-stakes tests. Education reform is a hot topic, and everyone involved says they want the best for their students. But what really works? Today on the Laura Flanders Show, an interview with Jessie Hagopian, a reformer who helped lead a student revolt in one school in Seattle, and New Orleans, a city that's transformed to an all-charter school system. All that, and I rushed to the defense of Scott Walker's education plan. Well, not exactly. Find out later. Welcome to our program. Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. The largest ongoing revolt against high-stakes testing in U.S. history. Did you know you were living through it? Our next guest is part of a movement challenging the regime of high-stakes testing in U.S. schools. Global warming, war, poverty, violence against women, disease, none of these problems can be solved by A, B, C, or D thinking, he writes in a new book. So why do we continue to sink hundreds of millions of dollars into teaching for just that sort of test? Jessie Hagopian teaches history and is the Black Student Union Advisor at Garfield High School in Seattle, which made history when teachers, parents, and students there chose to boycott their standard test in 2013. He's also editor of More Than a Score, the new Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing, just out from Haymarket Press. Welcome to the program,
Thanks
Jessie.
so
Great
much.
to have you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you.
So you call yourself a member of a movement of testifiers.
That's right.
Special spelling? Tell us what you mean.
We're a group that is refusing to give high-stakes standardized tests, refusing to take high-stakes standardized tests, opting our children out of these tests, and we're up against a testocracy. What I call the corporate education reformers who are trying to reduce the intellectual process of teaching and learning to a single number that they can then use to punish teachers and students, deny our kids graduation, bust up the teachers' unions, label the schools failing, and then close them like we've seen in Chicago or Philadelphia with scores of schools closed.
Now, what were the risks faced by your students, fellow teachers, even administrators there at Garfield as they considered this boycott of 2013?
Yeah, when we took the vote to decide whether or not to refuse to give the MAP test, teachers right away asked me what are the consequences we're going to face. Everyone knew this test was not giving us useful feedback to drive instruction. They knew it was a waste of our teaching and learning time, but the question they had for me was what's going to happen if we refuse, and I couldn't sugarcoat it. I let them know, you know, we have a progressive discipline policy, but especially if you're in a tested subject and you refuse to give it, you could be terminated. And in fact, when we announced that we were going to refuse to give this test, the superintendent issued a threat of a 10-day suspension without pay. And it was really the mass resistance of other schools joining the boycott, of our PTA voting unanimously to support our boycott, and the students themselves staging a sit-in in their own classroom, refusing to get up and go to the library to take this computer-generated test that kept us safe.
You write about it in the book where you are in a different room and you've done all this organizing, and it comes to the question of, are the students going to walk to the library and take that test?
Yeah.
Were you confident?
It was an incredible moment at Garfield High School because we knew the success of the boycott rested in the students' hands at that point. Administrators were told by the superintendent they had to go door to door and pull kids out of class and march them off to the computer lab. And when students heard their name called out and refused to get up, or some of the students went to the lab, but then they just hit the A key over and over again, so the scores were invalidated because the test was done in 30 seconds. It was really the linchpin of the resistance, and to see students standing up for their own education to say, I want to be in my teacher's class right now and take a test that actually is aligned to my curriculum, take an exam that actually means something to what I've been learning. was a powerful moment.
So why did they take those risks, the teachers, the students, the parents? George Bush is in favor of standardized testing, high-stakes testing. Barack Obama's in favor of it. What do you know that they don't?
Well, they don't actually send their kids to schools that use these exams. I've often said that actually the map test boycott didn't start at my school at Garfield High School, that in fact it began at Lakeside High School, a school down the road where Bill Gates went, where he sends his kids, because they never administered the exam, and they wouldn't do that to their own children, reduce teaching and learning to this score and teach to the test. For their kids, they want the arts. They want creativity and critical thinking taught in the classroom. But for our kids, they want this rote memorization. And that contradiction, I think, is what led to the map test boycott. And the map test boycott helped inspire an entire country as we saw more boycotts break out in the wake of ours across the nation.
And yet Bill Gates has been very influential in pushing this testing regime.
Absolutely. I mean, he's invested hundreds of millions of dollars, upwards of $200 million to implement the Common Core and the high-stakes tests that are attached to it with the PARCC and Smarter Balance. And we've seen one man who uses his fortune and his wealth to manipulate and subvert the democratic process of education and to impose his will over the democratic will of the community.
So talk about what you want instead. You talked about testing or evaluating that is in line with the curriculum and the teacher's goals. Sometimes critics of standardized tests are cast as people who are against testing altogether.
Right.
What are you for?
Right, absolutely, because teachers invented testing and we're not against assessment. We have to have ways to know how our students are doing. And I'm actually here in New York to visit the New York Consortium schools, which is an incredible group of some 28 schools across New York that have a waiver and don't have to give the state standardized tests. And instead, they have a system called performance-based assessment that is far superior to high-stakes standardized tests. And it's an incredible model, which is much like when you get your PhD, right? You do research over time. You develop a thesis. If your evidence doesn't match your thesis, you have to revise your thesis. You work with a mentor, a teacher, collaborate with peers. And at the end of a period of time, you present your research and you defend your thesis, much like a PhD candidate would defend their dissertation. And these students at the New York Consortium schools are doing this in every subject. And I think the proof is that the New York Consortium schools have higher graduation rates. They have their students of color performing and graduating at higher rates, going to college at higher rates, staying in college at higher rates. And the New York Consortium schools have larger numbers of students who are at risk and have special needs. So if the corporate education reformers truly were about improving achievement for all students, they would be flying the principals of these New York Consortium schools all over the nation to talk about why this assessment model and the inquiry-based classrooms that lead to it are creating such incredible outcomes for our students, but that's not their goal at all.
Well, talk about goals. You've referred to the corporate education reformers. Obviously, there's a money-making piece in this. George Bush's brother, Neil, was very invested in a company that was creating the test that the administration was pushing. Yeah. But there's another agenda here, too, that you allude to in the book.
Absolutely.
What's that?
I think there's the people who directly want to profiteer from the selling of the tests. That's part of what's driving it. But I think that there is larger goals at play here. One is that the teachers' unions are the last major national unions, the biggest unions left in America. And I think, especially after the 2008 Great Recession, that a major goal of the 1% in this country is to bust unions and to make America a low-wage economy that can compete with China.
But if unions have been keeping, just to play devil's advocate for a minute, if unions have been protecting bad teachers in their jobs, and a lot of people have criticisms of the tenure policy, even if they're supporters of the union in general, isn't it time for a change? Don't we need some of this changed?
Well, I would say that due process is a lot different than a job for life, as we're often painted the teachers union movement with. And I would also invite critics of the teachers unions to look at some important statistics. So the South, large swaths of the South don't have teachers unions. So are those schools outperforming the schools in the North? Well, by the measures of test scores that the corporate reformers hold so dearly, no, right? Actually, the unionized schools are performing better on the test scores, which completely debunks their logic and exposes the real quest of the corporate reformer, which is, I think, to bust the teachers unions, also to label our schools failing so that they can privatize them, right? If in Chicago, they label the schools failing mostly in black and brown neighborhoods, and then they move the charter schools in and have private operators use public funds to run them. And I think that's a big part of it. And the last part of what I think is behind this drive for high-stakes testing is also about training an entire population that knowledge is the ability to eliminate wrong answer choices from a prescribed list of answers that are given by the elite. And we want to reframe that and say that actually knowledge and wisdom is about empowering students to solve the problems they face in their world today. From the myriad of disasters that we face, from mass incarceration to climate change, these problems won't be solved unless we can develop critical thinking and imagination skills in the classroom.
Where did these tests come from, historically speaking? IQ testing and what's come since came in at a particular moment in history, particularly when it comes to race relations.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think that's an important history that lays bare the lies of the testocracy today, because they say that these tests are about closing the achievement gap. But if you know that these tests actually entered the public schools in the early 1900s, tests that were developed out of IQ tests that were first used during World War I to separate the officers from the grunt soldiers. And then a man named Carl Brigham was one of the men who developed those IQ tests. He taught at Princeton University, and then he developed the SAT test. Now, Carl Brigham was an open eugenicist, a white supremacist whose whole premise of these tests were about ranking and sorting the races to prove that white men were smarter than women, were smarter than immigrants, were smarter than African Americans. And now we see the same ABCD bubble testing that was brought into the public schools by eugenicists. They're claiming that these are going to be the tests that close the achievement gap, and I say that's nonsense.
So talk about the future of this movement that you're a part of. Many people involved in your struggles were also out in the streets in Seattle and elsewhere in the Black Lives Matter protests around policing. The stories in your book that come from teachers and administrators and parents about what's going on locally, there's a world of trouble coming to the status quo, I would say.
I hope you're right.
But how do you see it playing out, and where do you see the connections?
Yeah, I think that we have to see this movement against high-stakes standardized testing as a civil rights movement, and I think that the people that are part of this movement to end high-stakes standardized testing would do well to study the racist origins of these tests and to make connections between these tests and the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, there's a recent study that came out of Boston University that shows the #1 outcome of exit exams in high school to graduate is the increased incarceration rates. And so we're seeing the school-to-prison pipeline being built with these high-stakes tests. And so part of our movement must have an anti-racist message. And we need to say that when we say that Black Lives Matter, we're not just saying that young black people shouldn't be shot down in the street with impunity and no accountability for the police. We're saying that we need culturally relevant curriculum. We need a nurturing education system that's fully funded and develops the capacity of all of our students, especially those who have been historically discriminated against. And I would say the Black Lives Matter movement would also do well to join in with this movement against high-stakes standardized testing and say that we want more for our students.
If we were going to redefine education or redesign it for a more kind of group-oriented economy, how would it change?
Oh, it would look quite different. It would be about inquiry-based classrooms where students are asked open-ended questions, and they're asked to bring in their experience, and they're asked to do problem-based learning where we discuss problems that we face in our society, and we look to the different disciplines to help address those problems. We would have interdisciplinary classes so that if we wanted to tackle a problem like climate change, we could have courses designed where we integrate history of coal extraction and the Industrial Revolution together with science classes that look at issues around climate change and have a more holistic approach.
No, I wasn't sure that I didn't know that you were going to say that, but it does sound an awful lot like what Bill Gates says Common Core is about.
Yeah, except for he tells a lot of fibs, right? And the problem is that he's attached the same old high-stakes standardized tests with the A, B, C, D answers to Common Core, which then drive the curriculum towards teaching kids how to eliminate wrong answer choices rather than solving problems we face in our communities. And so I think that we need to move towards a student-centered approach and listen to teachers and have teachers and educators be the ones driving education reform, like we're seeing with the consortium schools here in New York, like we're seeing at my high school where we rejected the test and are now moving to implement alternatives.
All right, Jesse Hagopian, thank you so much for
I
coming in.
appreciate
Good
it.
luck
Thanks
with the
a
book.
lot. All right.
They are expecting some severe damage.
5 or 6 hours now of heavy rain to go along with that.
The Salvation Army plans to serve
where there were sewage
in terms of figuring out how much.
While people in Orleans Parish were still underwater and on rooftops, there was a plan being formed to take away the schools in Orleans Parish.
The public should know that the Orleans Parish School Board was pressured by the state education officials to start charter schools.
Superintendent Picard clearly stated to me and several other board members that he didn't want schools to open unless they opened as charter schools.
The state, when they took over 107 schools, did not have a plan to open the schools. Matter of fact, they didn't want to open them. Mr. Picard is quoted as saying he had no intentions of opening the regular schools. He wanted charter groups from around the country to open the school.
Of course, we found out later on that he had been working with the governor, or the governor at some point, I'm not sure if it was October of that year, signed the executive order, which basically removed all of the kind of requirements to become a charter school in terms of community and faculty and parent vote related to that, so which made charter schools basically able to happen almost overnight.
Discussion was being had by several Bessie members led by Leslie Jacobs on how can we take the schools? How can we get this district that's now on its knees, scrambling to stay alive, and kill it? Just kill it, the coup de grace. We have finally got an opening that would have taken us 40 or 50 years of back and forth and forth and back. It has been handed to us. How do we do that? Well, declare the district an academic crisis.
In the state capitol, there was another law being passed called Act 35.
17 days in November. At first, we all thought that the 17-day session was going to be reconstruction of New Orleans, housing, and things like that. When it became set with the complete takeover of the New Orleans school system and readjusting existing law that would only be targeted at New Orleans, then you saw it was something totally different.
The dirty deed in Act 35 is that the state changed the definition of what a failing school was so that it would bring in more schools than it had ever brought into the recovery school district.
No longer was a failing school with a performance score less than 60. A failing school got to be a school with a performance score less than the state average of 87.4. It definitely targeted New Orleans. I mean, it targeted New Orleans. New Orleans was the only school system that was taken over by Act 35.
Really, it could have bankrupted the school board, because what it did was then removed the bulk of schools away from Orleans Parish School Board. And just to put it in economic terms, if we don't have the buildings, then we can't have students. And if we don't have students, then we don't have money.
The takeover was to be a massive experiment in improving the schools.
I thought the goal was to just create new schools, innovative schools that work for our children, whether they're charter schools or not. A lot of money has come into New Orleans to open up new schools. That actually incentivizes school failure. The more schools fail, the more money certain organizations can get to open new schools. They give no thought to what closing a school does to a child. Closing a school just simply starts the money changing hands again.
After 7 years and millions of dollars, and the Recovery School District of New Orleans, when you look at all the school districts, is at the bottom, just like the New Orleans Public School District was at the bottom and on the date of the hurricane, August 29, 2005.
Governor Scott Walker stirred up the hornets this winter when he not only proposed cutting $300 million from the University of Wisconsin's budget, but simultaneously tried to change the vaunted mission of that 100-year-old institution from seeking truth and serving society to meeting the needs of the workforce. Walker's effort to edit UW's progressive-era principles angered educators and students and led party-predictable pundits to cry out about the presumed presidential contender's Tea Party plans for education. What's been missed in all this is that putting schools to work for business is hardly a Tea Party idea. Businesses have always looked to classrooms to serve up workers. Wisconsin's idea 100 years ago was notable precisely because the pressure was on for schools to produce workers fit for factories back then. Craftsmen had a nasty habit of walking off the production line at the degradation of their labor. The 1917 Smith-Hughes Act funded 2 tracks of education, the vocational and the general, to more smoothly ease blue and white-collar workers into place. Vocational ed endured until such time as U.S. manufacturers fancied shedding U.S. workers, when, in the 1980s and 90s, government started pushing college education for all, no matter how unpredictable or the cost. Today's high-stakes economy favors high-stakes testing. It's no surprise. Those tests are a nifty profit center in themselves, which is why so many profit-driven people are for them, but polarizing testing also serves the needs of a polarizing economy. Multiple, which is actually to say minimal choice tests, don't produce the kind of creative thinking we need, but they do enforce the idea of a meritocracy, and with it the thought that those at the top are deserving. When we interviewed people for Own the Change about starting worker-owned cooperative businesses, the single biggest challenge they named was a lack of training in cooperation. Now, Walker blamed his editing plan on an underlings error and backed away from it, but education for the workforce isn't going away. It's enshrined in today's Common Core curriculum, as school reformer Jesse Hagopian reports. The question for those who seek structural change now is if a polarizing education meets the needs of a polarizing workforce, what sort of education befits an economy that puts people first and the needs of profit behind community and the planet? You tell me. Write to me, Laura@grittv.org. And thanks.